I'm Rick Beeman, an old geezer, retired professor of history here at Penn, but I've also been involved with the committee which set the program for this year's set of workshops and conferences on constitution making, and I'm delighted to be here to moderate this session. And the focus of our attention is Professor Emily Zackin, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Hunter College in the City University of New York system. Emily's PhD dissertation, which she completed at Princeton University in 2010, was entitled Positive Constitutional Rights in the United States. It won all sorts of awards for the best dissertation in almost any subject area from the American Political Science Association. And that dissertation is soon to be published as Looking for Rights in All the Wrong Places, Why State Constitutions Contain America's Positive Rights. Emily tells me that that's due out in April of 2013, and the galleys are going to arrive very soon. Her paper today, of course, has the same title, so we're going to have the privilege of getting an advanced look at what we can expect from her book. Let me also introduce our discussant now, and then I'm going to back off and let the people who know something about these topics do their talking. My colleague Walter Lichte is a member of the Department of History at Penn, has been there almost as long as I have. He has achieved a distinguished career as an historian of American economic history and labor history. And unlike many of his colleagues, his intellectual interests in history really actually do range quite widely, which is why he was asked last year to comment on a paper in the history of corporations in America, and this year been asked to comment on Emily's paper. Walter's most recent book is The Face of Decline, the Pennsylvania Anthracite Region in the 20th Century, which was the winner of the very prestigious Merle Curdy Award from the Organization of American Historians. Before I get Emily up here, and before Emily and I do a transfer of microphones, I do want to say that if you are here as a part of the continuing legal education program, the folks from CLE are a little bit late in arriving, but if you could just raise your hands and let David Bateman know who you are, then he'll come around and get the appropriate information from you. Thank you very much for that. And Emily, without further ado, we'll do this changeover here.
Should I speak from here or in there?
Why don't you want to speak? Why don't you speak from here? You can do whatever you want, actually.
Sure, why?
What's
I'll sit.
Emily's going to sit.
I'm going to sit. All right. Okay. First, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming, and thank Rogers for inviting me, Chloe, Chelsea, and David for making my trip so smooth and giving me such a warm welcome, and Walter, thank you so much for your comments in advance. So my book began as a dissertation, and the dissertation began with a project on welfare rights. And I was looking at welfare rights movements based on the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, and I wrote this sort of second-year paper that said, well, they didn't get any traction or much traction. They didn't really go anywhere. And in working on this paper, I came across article after article, often law review articles, saying, yes, the reason we didn't have a successful welfare rights movement is that welfarist rights or positive rights or socioeconomic rights are simply outside the American constitutional tradition. They're just not how Americans do rights. Americans do rights that restrain the state. And in restraining the state, they protect people from the state. We don't do rights that ask the state or demand that the state reach out and do something to protect us from some non-governmental threat. So I read a bunch of that stuff. I didn't have a dissertation. And I didn't know what to do. And my advisor said, well, no one's really looking at state constitutions. You could try that. And I thought, oh, shoot me. This is the last thing I want to work on. But when I began the sort of looking, I poked around just a very little bit, and one of the first things that immediately jumped out at me was, well, actually we have all these positive rights here. And that was really the puzzle that began what is now my book project. Well, how do we explain that? And can I talk back to all of those people who say positive rights exist elsewhere, not here? So the two big questions that my book project tackles are, first, do we have positive rights? Can we make the argument that America really does have positive rights? And second, how did they get here? This is the kind of constitution writing puzzle. Why would people write these things into constitutions? So let me talk about both of those in turn. What I say about this first question, do we have positive rights, is that the argument that America lacks positive rights is extremely similar to broader American exceptionalism arguments. So you read people saying, this is about political culture. Americans are simply afraid of the state. Maybe it's because we didn't have feudalism. People even still say this, right? Maybe we didn't have feudalism. For whatever reason, Americans don't want a big protective state. We want protection from our state. And so when you read the Bill of Rights, it reads as a list of thou shalt nots. Now, of course, the American political development story that Americans just didn't have a government, we didn't have a state until the New Deal, and even then it's a kind of laggard state or somehow always cabined and cramped, has been so complicated as to be almost defunct. Right? So historians and political scientists no longer really say this. They say, well, we had a state, it just doesn't look like a Western European welfare state. And a big part of the reason that we haven't seen it is that we've only looked for it at the national level. If you look for regulation at the state and local level, so William Novak has this book and Brian Ballard has this book, and they both say we find lots and lots of regulation. So this is well understood, I argue, in American political development, that American exceptionalism is just not, it's at least far too simple. But in constitutionalism circles, I don't think this insight has been brought to bear. So people still make these, what I'm calling American constitutional exceptionalist arguments all the time. Other states have other constitutions have positive rights, we just don't. And I say, well, look, if we look at the subnational level, we see a whole host of positive rights. And in fact, if we look at the way people talked about these rights, it's not just the text themselves, but the way people talked about them, they said all the same things we associate with the logic of positive rights or socioeconomic rights. They said, we don't just need protection from our government, we don't just want private property protected, that doesn't help us. We don't have any property. We need some other kind of protection. We need the state to step in and give us something. So that's question one. Question two is, well, why constitutions then? Because if you want the state to step in and give you something, can't you just go to your legislature to get it? So why do we see these movements not just for protective regulation, but actually for positive rights? And I talk about this question in the context of the larger literature on where rights come from at all. And that literature starts with a puzzle, which is if you have enough power to write the Constitution, you must be in some kind of position of political dominance. Why would you put a right into it? If a right is a check on discretion, the discretion of governmental officials, what good could you see coming from a check on your own discretion if you're the people in power? And the answer that has emerged is a very elegant answer, which is you're not trying to check your own discretion. You're looking over your shoulder and you think, I may not be in power forever, but I've made all these legislative gains. I need to protect them. I need to entrench them. And I can do that by writing them right into the Constitution. And then if I can get my people on a constitutional court, even once I've lost the sort of reins of the lawmaking institutions, or I've lost a democratic majority, the court can enforce or protect the status quo I've established against tinkering by a new majority or a new legislative coalition. So the sort of three big tenets of this, what I'm calling entrenchment theory, or a theory about where rights come from, are rights are written by people in a position of power because they want to entrench the status quo and they want to do it through judicialization. And I see some of that, and some of the examples of positive rights making I look at do look very much like that. But I also see examples that really look nothing like that. So they're people who are not the most marginalized, but certainly not in a position of lawmaking power. They're reformers. They're seeking constitutional rights because they're frustrated with the legislature. They want change, and they use constitutions to try to force the hand of the legislature. So they say to themselves, and I'll use the example of labor, Labor says in many Western states, look, our legislature's in the pockets of the mining companies or the railroad companies. Think about the Gilded Age here. What we need to do is find a way to force them to pass the kind of protective labor regulations that the mining companies don't want them to pass. If we can do it by putting it right in a constitution, by making a demand in the Constitution that they create an 8-hour day or mandate escapement shafts built into the mines, then we can go to the legislature with this mandate in the Constitution and say, you have to do this. And in fact, it's been ratified by the electorate of the state, and so we have this electoral threat. We can say that the people of the state want this, or they will vote you out of office. So this is sort of one addition that I offer to the literature on where constitutional rights come from. Well, people pursue these rights not because they want to entrench the status quo, or not only because they want to entrench the status quo, but also because they want change. They want to push the legislature to make change they're having trouble getting otherwise. Then another reason, and this is also especially true of labor, is to shut down hostile courts. So if you're worried that a court is going to rule your piece of legislation, your favored policy, unconstitutional, one piece of insurance against that is to turn around and put it right in the Constitution. It's much harder for a court to say this is unconstitutional or the 8-hour day is unconstitutional if it appears in the Constitution. And so labor does this again and again in their writings about why we should pursue constitutional change. They say, because our statutes can just get thrown out by courts. But if we say if it's in the Constitution, courts are going to have a much harder time claiming it's unconstitutional. So that's the second reason. Not just to the entrenchment theorists show us that constitutions can turn on courts, and I'm saying, well, constitutions have also been written in order to turn off courts, at least in particular policymaking venues. And then the third reason is a reason that has less to do with the kind of external political goals of a movement and more to do with its internal politics or its movement building needs. So movements often say, if we can get this in a constitution, it will be the most powerful rallying cry or the most successful organizing tool that we've ever had. And this is one argument they make internally about the value of putting something in a constitution. And then externally, they do a lot of credit claiming. They get it in the Constitution and they say, we, the Montana Federation of Labor, or we, the Massachusetts Forest and Park Association, we've managed to change the state constitution. Our voice has been heard. So this is the third reason I offer, in addition to the entrenchment theory, that people seek to add rights to their constitutions. And I look in particular at three movements. I look at the Common School movement, which begins in the Jacksonian era. I look at the Gilded Age and Progressive era labor movement, and I look at the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s. So let me just say, before I want to talk a little bit about some sort of broader implications for the thinking about constitutionalism or American constitutionalism. Before I do that, I do really want to say, I have emphasized in what I've just talked about, and especially much of my book and this chapter you've read, emphasizes the kind of redistributive, protective, welfarist qualities of these positive rights. We want an 8-hour day, we want a minimum wage, we want clean air and water, that kind of thing. There's also an undeniably exclusionary element to all of these movements. And let me talk about labor, since I think that'll be the focus of today's discussion. And the labor movement does say everyone should have the right to live, the right to protection in his person, the right to eat. And then they say, of course, we don't mean Mexican immigrants, or we don't mean Chinese immigrants, depending on the state. So in California, for example, the Working Men's Party of 1879 captures a third of the Constitutional Convention in California. I mean, they elect their own delegates right to the Constitutional Convention, and their rallying cry is, the Chinese must go. So they add an 8-hour day right to the Constitution. It's considered a big, and lots of anti-corporate measures, it's considered a big victory for labor. They also add an entire article to the Constitution about Chinese exclusion. And this is very common, that each of these movements, at least it's common in the three I look at, that each of these movements says, we want these benefits from government, and then they quickly draw lines about, but these people should get them, and these people shouldn't. So I wouldn't want to end my comments without mentioning that sort of substantively important piece of the story. All right, so finally, just a few thoughts on what this tells us more broadly about American constitutionalism. Well, first, I think the argument is you can't just study American constitutionalism by looking at the federal Constitution. That gives us a really distorted picture of what American constitutional practices look like. And here I think labor movement is a great example. So the very famous work of Bruce Ackerman says, the New Deal is a constitutional moment. People wake up and they think, oh, Lochner is terrible, right? All of the substantive due process stuff, that has to go. And instead, we need to have a whole different view of Congress's commerce powers or of what the meaning of the due process clause. But I say, well, that's only true if the only thing you look at is federal constitutional law. If you look at states, people are making these arguments against substantive due process starting in like the 1870s. This isn't a constitutional moment, it's a constitutional movement. It happens state by state by state, but it's a nationwide movement to change our understanding of the Constitution. And I think that's just an example of how you can get a really distorted view of how constitutionalism, especially American constitutionalism, works if you're only looking at the federal level. So I borrow Sandy Levinson's phrase here. He talks about America's 51 constitutions. I think he's exactly right. That's how we should understand American constitutionalism. Second has to do with the kinds of provisions I look at. So these things I'm calling positive rights, some of them say labor must have the right to just reward for his services. They're this big sort of rights language. But most of them say the legislature shall mandate the provision of escapement shafts from mines, or shall mandate that wages be paid every 2 weeks in legal tender. These are sort of little niggling details that have caused many observers to dismiss state constitutions. So I say, we need to consider America's state constitutions, and people say, aren't those just full of like weird little policies? And I say, no, these aren't weird little policies, except if you read them maybe one constitution on its own. These are actually, if you read all of these constitutions together, and you look at the people who are trying to put them in, these are rights, right? These are mandates on government designed very particularly to check its discretion. They're not big, broad mandates written with the hope that the sort of heroic constitutional court will step in and push their agenda. They're often written to shut down a court or to push a legislature forward, but that these details aren't mistakes. They're in fact crafted very carefully to do the political work they're meant to do within a particular institutional environment. So one point here is we shouldn't just dismiss constitutions for looking unlike the national constitution. Constitutions are written for political purposes. I mean, there are sort of deep moral commitments motivating these movements about the role of government. But then the form those commitments take is often determined by the institutional environments those actors are seeking to affect. Which is finally to say that I want to push against a reading of constitutions, and particularly bills of rights, as catalogs of a nation's highest values, which is how I think so many people read the Bill of Rights now. Aha, here are the things we most value. And there's been work done, like Richard Primus's work at the federal level, saying that's a mistake to read it that way. But I think my work kind of contributes to that movement, to say constitutions are often about values, but they're about values in particular political contexts. And it's a mistake to compare national constitutions, or even any constitutions, and say, from this we can read off what a society most values. We have to understand constitutions as values in political contexts. So I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you. Should I give you my...
Yeah. Sinking into that.
I think you just pin this on your lapel.
This on my lapel. Got me? Hear me? Okay, good. I just will preface my preface here. I had the benefit of one of the chapters out of this book, so some of these comments come from that, and it was the one on labor. So I'll be referring to things that many of you did not see specifically in the other things. So I'm going to, what? Oh, they were. I didn't realize that. I thought you just made it available to me. Okay. I'm going to confess at the outset of my remarks that I picked up Emily's paper, which has just a great, great title. Somewhat cynical in mind and mood. And many of you know me personally, I am not a cynic at all in nature. But I was feeling I am going to cringe if I see that expression, laboratories of democracy. And after all, I think it was in the second presidential debate, then none other than Mitt Romney, in arguing for reducing the costs of Medicaid, said just hand, block grants to the states. They, and he used that expression, the laboratories of democracy, he did use that expression, will figure out how to best dispense health care to the poor. Yeah, exactly right, hand it to the states and we can gut the program here. So when I see even in one place the word state and rights, I cringe a bit because when I see those two words, all I actually can think about is states' wrongs. And the list of wrongs in the names of states' rights or what states have done is long. It is because of states' rights. We had slavery, we had apartheid laws after emancipation, the miserably financed public education systems we have, which have been open to all sorts of parochial small-mindedness. And just last week, because of this, you can see the just convoluted voting systems that we have have always been open to denials of enfranchisement. So, and I suspect there are other favorites you can add to this list of the sort of states' wrongs before we get to the states' rights. Now, I know this is not what Emily is up to in this paper, whether we are best served by the federal government or the state government. That's not what she's up to here at all. But as I read what is a sort of homage, to the state, I would raise a large question with her, and maybe she does this in her book, how are you going to balance this sort of positive aspects of democracy that you see here at the level of the state with the obvious corruptions, the hold on state governments, powerful economic interest groups, the bigotries, the parochialisms so manifest in state governance since the beginnings of the Republic. And of course, we have a great case in point, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for all the manifestations of corruption, bigotry, parochialism. So there is an homage to this localist government and the ability to petition that government in the name of rights, but I'm curious in the book how you do balance that with a rather dreary record and a wrong record as well. So I know it's unfair in terms of what you're doing here, but I'm curious about how you do deal with that sort of knee-jerk cynicism that I approached when I picked up the paper. And in fact, that's not Emily's project here, and it's not the great value of her research. What I see as the great value of the research are three things, and they kind of are sequential here. First, she really has proven to us and is telling us, and I think proven, that you can find traditions of positive rights governance in the United States. That we do have systems of rights that not just protect us from an overbearing state or the potential of an overbearing state, but rights that can provide us somewhat better standards at work and at living, our very well-being. So she's saying, yeah, we do have these positive rights. And not only has there been this tradition, but one can best find that tradition at the level of state government, which I think is a terrific contribution to the understanding of American political history. And then finally, which I think is really the key here, and more specifically, is that we can find the means of that through state constitutional writing and rewriting and amendment processes. And much more so than in the state legislative processes, but we can find this in the constitutional amendment writing and rewriting here. And that is new. I mean, that I think is a major contribution. And the big eye-opener for me, because I can think of very few works written by American political historians, maybe political scientists do this, which have even just look to the state for beginners, but then even look to the issue of state constitution writing. And I think this is going to be well received. I think this is going to have an impact among the writers of American political history. So thank you for that. And that's what I think the great contribution here is. I have just to hopefully promote good discussion here. I have a couple of suggestions, one odd, and then some questions that might guide some of the conversation here. One of the things I was in thinking about this is this sort of an irony about that this is the place at the state, at the level of state constitution writing, that we see this assertion of some positive rights is a function of federalism itself, that geographical division of governance. We have many different divisions of government, some functional, some just geographical. And it's funny, it drew me to a kind of intellectual thought experiment that one can think about here. And it drew me back to an era of time I don't know that well. My colleague Rick Beeman knows full well. Back to the very peculiar pattern of British colonization in North America. Things might have been otherwise. The British Crown really authorized 13 different projects here, imperial projects here, not one. Each from a very early start developed forms of self-government before they eventually unified to decide to secede from the empire here. And I was just thinking, what if the British had actually followed the Spanish path here, a more centralized path, with a kind of, from the very beginning, a structure of centralized royal government. That centralized royal government, they may have decided to secede anyway from that, but you might have built on traditions where you just exchange one kind of centralized system for another, and there we go to get the positive rights to the center, as happens in other countries, to the parliament, the National Assembly. And history might have been different had we begun in that kind of centralized way, and there would have been that constant approach, petition, as you have petitions of the locality here, for those positive rights. We have this peculiar division created, by the Crown's authorization of 13 separate projects. And that may have had long legacies here into where we find the place where we can apply for those rights. So in some ways, that form of colonialism gave us the federal system in many ways, which gave us the history show here that the openings there were, at least at the state level, for these positive rights. In other places, be it Bismarck's Germany or the kind of Great Britain or the Scandinavian countries, all of those approaches for positive rights, building up a more elaborated welfare system than we have here, are really not at the local level. It's the application to the state assembly, to the parliament here. We, from day one, have this geographically fractured kind of government here. So there's a little kind of irony here. That's just dwelling and thinking about this. I have some questions here, and you have already dealt with one, but I think there's going to be lots of questions about it, and it's maybe the easiest one to hurl at you, and that is the question, well, what about race? And you spoke to it, but I think we do have to speak more about it. In none of the examples, either in this introduction or in the detailed chapter out on labor, do you have any example of the furtherance of positive rights to minority groups? So that is got to be dealt with, and I know you did in a sentence or two, and I suspect you have to do in the book. But there is that issue of this kind of petitioning is not universalistic, and that is a big question for me. Can positive rights only be universalistic, and if they're less than universalistic, so how positive are they? And that is a very important question that's raised here for me by the examples you give. And I'll extend on that because in the chapter I read, and I gather all of you had on labor, it comes from that reading where none of it speaks to the issue of race. In the case study on labor, what strikes me, and a question I raised here, is was the activity we see in this petitioning more about tactic than it is necessarily about the extension of positive rights? And it obviously is not the extension of rights universalistically, but it's to the particulars of whomever can petition, and petition aptly and effectively. So what do I mean by tactic? Well, in the examples I read in the labor chapter, it seems very strategic on their part, less driven by any philosophic position or any notions about rights. They are acting in circumstances where the courts are constantly against them. The courts are constantly enjoining their very activities. The courts are overturning any state legislation that seemingly negates somewhat the powers of employers to hire in any way they want to hire and fire people. And so in the face of this, the opposition of the courts to the simple activity of striking, and then overturning all of this protective legislation, they tactically realize that even if they've got some sympathetic legislatures around, that could be overturned. These guys could lose power. Let's just encase this in constitutional amendment here. And as I read these stories, and I know these stories, from my own reading of labor history, I always took that as not necessarily a philosophical position about the state. Is it anti-statist or not anti-statist? Well, I think they would just, this is pure strategy and tactic here, not involved in any larger sense that we are establishing rights, and they certainly weren't establishing universal rights. Related, I'm struck, and again, it comes to this thing, can you talk about positive rights if it's not applied, it's not being applied universally? That what we have here seems, a bit of not only strategy, but a kind of pluralistic politics at work, not a universalistic politics at work, so that you have certain groups being fairly effective in applying for rights and encasing them in constitutions to reduce the hours of work, to have better safety measures at places of employment. But most often, some of them are a little more universal than others. Most often they are applying to certain sets of workers. And they seem to be applying to those who are best able to organize, and those usually are skilled workers, which are usually white Anglo-Saxon Protestant workers. And they also are able to, they're aimed particularly at those groups who seem to be in the most perilous of circumstances, and those usually apply to railroad workers and miners, two groups of workers I know full well. Or to those who are seemingly in peril, these maidens, these young girls who are in mills, and we will make life less perilous for them too with this legislation here. I don't know, since it's so particularistic, again, I don't know whether I want to say this is an attempt for the sense of positive rights as you would like to have it, or as I think is often referred to when we look at constitutions of the sort of welfare states of Europe, where there will be a universal right for health, affordable health care, universal right for affordable housing, or universal right to retire with a decent means to survive. I don't know if it seems too particularistic for me necessarily to label as this is an assertion of a positive right that makes things better for all. So again, it's a tricky issue here. I hope we can open this up to debate about if it's less than universalistic, are you going to want to say, you want to even apply the word positive to it as a positive right? And again, even as I again, in the sense of the protective forms of legislation, are they so positive? They're all protective. They're against some negative circumstance. It's not an assertion of something better for all. And the negative circumstance is often taken to be the perilousness of it. Finally, this is purely informational and a question to you in this eye-opener of all of this activity at the state level, particularly in the Gilded Age, that's the chapter I read, to encase better conditions, put it like that, of life and work into a constitution rather than achieve it through state legislation, through statute. It's amazing how often this is done. And I'm just interested in the process of the Constitution writing and rewriting, because as I read the chapter, it seems like almost daily practice to get something into the Constitution. And, I have the sense of constitutions, you have a convention to write a constitution. Here, I'm not sure there are conventions. Occasionally, there seem to be conventions. Then it seems these things just get on the books pretty fast. Sometimes they need a referendum. Sometimes they do not need a referendum. Something is very mysterious to me. And is it just, politics as usual? You can achieve things in either ways. But there's a mystery of the process here. And also, I was wondering how similar this process is over the number of states we're dealing with. Does this vary by the different states, by regionally or whatever? So I'm sure I get this in a book, but the processes seem absent of the papers, and it's very, very curious to me. Anyway, I'm going to end right now. But I want to sort of end with a reiteration of the issue of thanks. My thanks as an American historian to an American political scientist. I know personally what I have to do, but I suspect once this book comes out, there are a lot of American historians who are going to be scurrying around rewriting their lectures, this one included, because there has been this utter neglect, ignorance of this kind of activity, ignorance purely of what's happening at the state, and what's happening in these states, besides, that occasional piece of populist legislation, that you love. And then the form it takes, constitution writing, is just a total it will be an eye-opener to most American political historians. So our thanks to you.